He's Professor Alfred de Zayas, former United Nations independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, former Secretary of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and Chief of the Petitions Section in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Professor Alfred, thank you very much for joining us on this auspicious evening, which may very well be our very biggest audience ever. And the reason for that very big audience is that people want to hear the other side of the story, and they're not getting it in the mainstream media. But you're here because you're an expert in diplomacy. You could have solved this if they'd given it to you. How would you have solved it?
On the basis of the United Nations Charter, which is the world constitution. But if you want to solve a problem, you need good faith. And good faith is in very short supply, especially on the side of NATO countries. I mean, there's no reason to be provoking. Don't forget that Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter prohibits not only the use of force as NATO used against Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria, etc. It prohibits the threat of the use of force. And what is no more threatening than having tons and tons of weapons flown into Ukraine next to the borders of Russia? Certainly the United States would not be happy to have Mexico join a so-called defense alliance or a military alliance with Russia or with China. Well, obviously, Russia doesn't want Ukraine at its doorstep, or Georgia for that matter, becoming a member of NATO. It is understandable. And the two treaties that Lavrov presented in the month of December, I read them. They are quite reasonable. And I think the solution could have been reached already in the first days of January. And I think it would have been entirely reasonable. There's plenty of historical examples of countries that either by treaty or by unilateral declaration have become neutral. So a declaration of neutrality on the part of Zelensky would have left the door open to friendly relations with the West and with the East. But of course, NATO is not interested in that because the military-industrial complex runs with tension. That's the only way you can persuade parliaments to adopt trillion-dollar military budgets instead of using the money for infrastructure, for education, for combating poverty, for healthcare, etc. No. Let's put it into more missiles and drones and airplane carriers, etc. But now, allow me to say something before we go on, because we have limited time. It is my priority, my concern, first of all, stop the fighting. I don't want to see young Ukrainians and young Russians killing each other. I don't want to see Ukrainians used by NATO in its imperial fantasies, in its imperial geopolitics. I want peace. And after peace, I join Antonio Guterres in saying, now we will need humanitarian assistance, both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians of Donbass and Lugansk and Donetsk. Now, it's important to consider that in the run-up to this absurd situation in which we find ourselves, there were many moments in which NATO could have made some minor concessions that actually I think would have satisfied Putin. I mean, one of the main problems with NATO is its imperial narcissism, and the fact that it's only they, and then they are incapable of thinking outside the box. They're incapable of putting themselves in the position of the Russians and trying to understand it from the Russian perspective. That is, in terms of diplomacy, very stupid. Now, I'm not the first person to say that. I mean, Professor John Mearsheimer has said the same in his book, The Great Delusion. And obviously, the press doesn't tell you that, but back in 1997, George Foster Kennan, whom I met several times in Princeton, and who actually gave me the name for my very first book published by Routledge. It's called Nemesis at Potsdam. In any event, Kennan wrote an article in the New York Times in which he warned about expanding NATO. I mean, if we threaten the Russians, that is going to have consequences. Now, he's not alone in saying that. The last American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, he wrote also recently a very long article in which he explains the fact that, of course, there were assurances given, and we have broken those assurances. We have this culture of cheating, and we think that cheating is fun. We think that cheating makes us daring and visionary. Now, the consequences we're seeing, and now people are dying. Now, I think Putin miscalculated. I think it was a great mistake to actually use military force. That certainly violates Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, and any attempt to say this is preemptive self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter really is not valid. It's not a valid argument, and it was not valid when NATO used it in the case of Iraq. You will remember the weapons of mass destruction, etc., etc. I mean, here is a situation where the United Nations actually failed us, because the United Nations could have been the mediator, let alone the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, let alone the Helsinki Final Act, and everything. Actually, all of the mechanisms are there, huh? And the law is pretty clear. I mean, what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was a vulgar coup d'etat. And the European Union immediately recognized the putschists. It is really shocking for democratic countries, or ostensibly democratic countries, immediately to recognize an unconstitutional regime in Kiev. And then this regime, instead of saying, okay, fine, we will have greater economic relations with the West, but we still want to keep our relations with the East, they start adopting Russophobic laws, prohibiting the use of the Russian language, all sorts of ridiculous things. And you can understand the population in Donetsk and Luhansk, they felt menaced by these idiots in Kiev. The population in Crimea felt menaced, and they, of course, held a referenda, the same as in many other countries, whether it be Kosovo or Slovenia or Croatia, and said, we want out. We don't want to be together with these nutcases. And the Parliament of Crimea, for instance, declared itself unilaterally independent, and it went through all the rule of law stages, being officially requested, formally requested to be reincorporated into Russia. That worked well. The parliament in Russia examined the case, approved it, went to the Constitutional Court of Russia, Constitutional Court approved it, then Putin signed it. Now, the people in Donetsk and Lugansk would have wanted to have the same thing. Unfortunately for them, Putin, until now, has been a very good chess player. And until now, he's been very moderate. So he said, okay, let's have these two republics of Luhansk and Donetsk get internal self-determination, not secession, just an autonomous status, like in so many countries. In a federal state, you can have any number of autonomous units, and they can have their language and their culture and their thing. That's what everybody wants. I mean, let's face it, the realization of self-determination is a conflict-preventive strategy. And that is what the United Nations should have been doing, organizing referenda, a UN organized and monitored referendum in Crimea, in Lugansk, in Slaviansk, in Donetsk, in Mariupol, wherever, in any event, to find out where do these people want to go. And what irritates me no end is that Ursula von der Leyen and Jens Stoltenberg, nobody wants to know what the people in Donbass want. I mean, it's easy to find out. Hold the referendum. No. They want to maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Well, why don't they want to keep the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia?
Ah, now you're talking. Professor, we've run out of time. I could listen to you all night. I'm really grateful to you for joining us. Professor Alfred de Zayas.